Hi, good evening, everybody.
Hello. So does it look like, okay. So we're now live. I'm Maha Bali from the American University in Cairo and co-facilitator of Equity Unbound. We're organizing this webinar together about inclusive citation, inclusive academia. Oh, hang on a sec. I forgot that it does that. It plays YouTube in the background while I'm in the session. Okay, and I'm going to also record to the cloud, as I said earlier, because that will create an automatic transcript for the session so that if people want to follow that way afterwards. Welcome everyone to the session. I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves just really quickly, who they are and which institution and country they're in right now. And then I'm going to ask participants to start just introducing themselves in the chat, like who they are again, which institution or which country, whichever you're comfortable saying. And I'll do a couple of very small intro activities, and then we'll get into the panel. So maybe we can go alphabetically. Doris, Jasmine, Kim, Mia, Titolini. Did I get that right? I think so. Okay, go ahead. Doris, you're muted. I think that's maybe the most said statement since COVID. You're still muted. I'm gonna unmute you, okay? Oh, that didn't work. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Doris Jones. I am a senior instructor in the Department of Rhetoric and Composition at the American University in Cairo. I am currently in the United States, enjoying my time with my family, and I do have hopes of returning to Egypt perhaps at the end of the summer.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Roberts. I'm a lecturer at The Ohio State University. And yeah, I think that's about it about me.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Fox. I teach at the American University in Cairo in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mia Zamora. I'm the director of the Masters in Writing Studies program in the English department at Kean University, which is in New Jersey, some 20 minutes or so outside of New York City. And I'm also a co-facilitator with Maha, like regarding Equity Unbound, which is a project that we've been doing for a while, and we're hosting this conversation today through Equity Unbound.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tudaleni Asino, and I am at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma, where I am an associate professor of educational technologies and also the director of the Emerging Technologies and Creativity Research Lab. It's odd to be in the US at this time because I'm from Namibia, and around May through August, I'm usually enjoying my winter at home right now. But thank you, COVID.
Yeah, that's the first time I hear someone say thank you, but I understand where you're coming from. I'm going to share some slides to do something really quickly with everyone, and then we're going to get into the conversation. Hopefully the panelists will speak for around 25 minutes, and then we'll have room for questions, and we'll start responding to the questions that you all submitted when you registered. Okay, so let me just share very quickly. This is going to be the quickest presentation ever. So just the first thing, I know I've given you a chance to introduce yourselves in the chat. I'd also love to hear how you're feeling today. It's a difficult time, and I think sometimes how I feel from moment to moment changes. I just wanted to know how you're feeling right now. So just type that in the chat. I have a headache. I think you need to change the glasses, Autumn. Tired and exhausted and overwhelmed. I hear that a lot. So far, so good today. Hope and despair. Yeah, I feel that too. Enraged, hungry. You should get something to eat, Mia. Exhausted, busy. Yeah, I don't know if busy is a feeling. I think busy is a state. I don't know, George, if it's a feeling. Cautiously hopeful. Yeah, numb. Yeah, numb is probably one of the worst feelings, I think. Relaxed and pensive. I guess some people are still also introducing themselves. I'll let you keep going with that. And I also wanted to do something, like I have a map here of the world, and I thought it might be nice to give people a chance just to say where they're from and their hybridity. So if you like belong to more than one place, you can show more than one place. And the easiest way to do that on Zoom is if you look at the top of your screen, there's a view options thing and you can annotate. And then you can pick a stamp and then you can pick one of the shapes like a star or something like that. If you're comfortable doing that, it'll help us see the diversity of people in the room. Yes, I can see people already doing that. Great. If you can't figure it out, it's not a problem. You can do like a line. You don't have to do the stamp because some devices I think don't have stamps on them. My daughter's confirming that some devices don't have stamps. Okay. Zerka sort of, hey, we have someone from South Africa as well. Australia, US, and Mexico, I think. Is that Mexico? One of the problems with this activity is it's going to show how bad your geography is because you can start naming the wrong country. So there are people in the UK, Ireland area and the Gulf area. As well. Okay, thank you to those who contributed. Okay, Kim is going to be helping me facilitate the conversation. I'm gonna stop sharing this now, and oh, we're getting more. I'm gonna save this so that we can keep it for later if we want it, and clear all, and then just stop sharing my screen and start the conversation. I think, if I'm not wrong, that Jasmine was going to start us off. Is that right, Jasmine? Thank you. So you've got 5 minutes, and we'll try to stop you when the 5 minutes are over. It's going to be hard.
It's okay.
Because we're going to want to listen to you more. Go ahead.
It's okay to say sorry to interrupt, but you're all out of time. So I wanted to first start by defining inclusion for me. And I literally have a definition here on my screen that I kind of sort of want to read word for word, but not exactly. So inclusion and inclusive scholarship for me is a radical practice that involves inviting everyone to sit at the table, figuratively and literally, excuse me. And those people, of course, are heard, their scholarship is heard. And we're all working toward a common goal that benefits a wide variety of populations. So, consequently, this involves the work of centering the marginalized and the process of accepting contributions from diverse groups. And this has to lead to, of course, meaningful engagement, through reflection and the actual application of those contributions to one's research, teaching philosophy, overall program, and of course your lived experiences, right? So this will benefit us as scholarly practitioners, but also it benefits our students. It makes them feel like their cultural ways of producing knowledge and education is in fact valuable. And I really relate to this as being further enough or far enough from the undergraduate experience, but not quite, because I'm still in my 30s. And those who are in the open ed community, you've heard this story from me a lot, where I was in a history of investigative journalism course. And I'm kind of going through the syllabus and looking at all the things that we'll be discussing. And I noticed that we're not discussing a very prominent journalist, and that journalist is Ida B. Wells. And for those who don't know, Ida B. Wells was a badass Black journalist in the late 1800s, early 1900s. She launched an anti-lynching campaign. She revealed just the violence that was taking place. She's also a suffragette. She's a co-founder of the NAACP, all of these things that people don't realize in terms of Ida B. Wells' contribution to our society. And so I remember asking that professor, will we be talking about Ida B. Wells? And she kind of looked at me like, well, who's Ida B. Wells? And I proceeded to tell her who she is. And she said to me, I'm sorry, that's not in the curriculum, it's not in the textbook. And I remember feeling like, wow, so Black journalists aren't important enough to be included in this curriculum. And so, of course, it's my goal now that I'm on the other side of academia to make sure my students don't feel the same, but I have my blinders, of course. And so I say all that to say I've been having this really rich conversation with my colleagues about inclusive scholarship and citation and diversifying your curriculum. And it's really interesting how in the US context, at least, we hold on to this notion of academic freedom and autonomy, which, of course, stems from white cultural ideologies that value a very rugged sense of individualism. So I think it's interesting how we pull out that academic freedom card when it involves diversifying your curriculum or engaging in inclusive scholarship. But we don't directly talk about academic responsibility, right? And how we can achieve both academic autonomy and freedom while still making sure that we're upholding academic responsibility and serving the public, especially if you're a public institution, and serving students and scholars from all different backgrounds. And so again, if we go back to my definition of inclusion, it involves working toward a common goal that benefits a wide variety of people. And so this is going to entail a very uncomfortable process of looking inward and whether we are actually aligning with our values in academia. And so again, if we're talking about the goals of inclusion, we of course need to have same goals. And so my question to academics and scholarly practitioners is what is our goal in academia? Are we truly building global citizenship and developing the human in scholars and students? Or are we just producing values that privilege, elitism, that the belief of Western ways of producing knowledge are superior? And we try to cloak that with, cute little diversity inclusion statements. So that's my question for academics now. And then the last thing I kind of want to leave you all with is it's my hope, because this moment feels very different, but it's my hope that we avoid reactive inclusive strategies, some of what we're seeing right now. Instead, what my hope is that we strive towards a more radical rooting of inclusive scholarship that's, again, rooted in academic practices and traditions. Oh, I'm sorry, and that's it. I think.
So much to think about, Jasmine. Fantastic.
Tutaleni, I think you're up next.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this conversation, which is really, really important. I think I'm going to start off in terms of how I come to this conversation. I'm going to tie back to something that Jasmine said in terms of inclusivity, the academy, and this idea of service. You can't be of service to the community if you're ignoring certain people who are part of that community. It just becomes very difficult to do that. So for me, the way that I come to this is in a few ways. One, I'm trained as a comparative international researcher. And from that perspective, one of the sort of the key tenets of comparative education is that by learning about how others people educate, how they do things, it helps me learn about my own practice and also improve my own practice. So inherent in that is this idea that I need to know what other people are doing, and even those people who are not from my community or look like me and so forth. So for me, that's really important. The other part is this idea of the importance of telling our own stories. There is an old African proverb of until lions becomes their own historians, the tale of the hunt is always going to glorify the hunter, right? So this idea that if we're not telling our own stories, somebody's out there telling them, and often they're telling them inaccurately. I had read an article from a peer-reviewed journal last year on a study in Namibia, and the president of Namibia is being listed as someone who's actually the president of Kenya. And I was starting to think to myself, like, how did that go through a peer review process when something like that should be so obvious? And part of that for me is because there's not enough people who are involved in that conversation. So for me, the way that I come to this is I don't think inclusivity is about being nice. That's not really what that's about. I think that's okay to be nice, but that's not what it's about. It's really about being accurate. It's about expanding knowledge, because there's just certain, I'm not going to be able to know everything that's out there. And if everybody who's writing is from Namibia, we're not going to be able to know exactly what the other part of the world is thinking about this exact thing. So we could be looking at a phenomenon where that can benefit from multiple perspectives. So I think that is really also an important. So for me, inclusivity is about expanding knowledge. It is about finding solutions for multiple perspectives. I don't think it really has anything to do with nice, although there's nothing wrong with being nice. I think it's very important. But I don't think we are including people just for the sake of being inclusive. It is also really important to be able to grow and expand the knowledge base. And we can only do that if we have more different people in the conversation. For me, it's similar to the first time when I was doing my PhD at Penn State. I found more work about Namibia in the Penn State Library, except most of the people that are writing those books, I don't think have even stepped foot in my country. So that, I'm not questioning the validity of that scholarship, but I have to wonder, how would that story have been if somebody who told it was actually from that community? And then sort of the last point about that, the part where that becomes an issue is that when I was trying to justify my problem in my dissertation, because the literature the story that I wanted to tell, I couldn't find those citations in the so-called validated databases and academic journals, it really inhibited me from being able to actually tell the story that I wanted to, because I didn't have that literature to support it. So, which for me, I'll end also with that. We also have a massive responsibility for that, in terms of, are we also citing ourselves? And are we also contributing to telling those same exact stories that should be told?
Thank you, Tutaleni. Doris? It's still muted. I think your unmute button doesn't work very well.
See?
You're still,
Okay.
yes. Now.
Yes, all right. Hi there, everyone. Once again, I'm Doris Jones. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Rhetoric and Composition at the American University in Cairo. And how do I manage to fit into this wonderful conversation that has begun? I am someone who loves history. I often find that certainly the seminal quote, "The past is prologue," that basically our past certainly establishes the context for the present. And with that said, the response to the horrific murder of George Floyd has prompted what I have deemed to be a seismic reaction across the United States and around the world. It has resulted in an international movement known as Black Lives Matter. And this movement has brought about significant recommendations for police reform, and even the recommendation for defunding the police. And more specifically, I do believe Senator Kamala Harris put it best, that there is such a misconception about what defunding the police means, and more specifically, how defunding the police fits into a much larger historical context. Defunding does not mean to remove the police overall from communities. Defunding means to actually take, in part, some of the financial resources that are currently being placed into policing and perhaps redistribute this funding to allow for communities to build the types of infrastructure that is necessary for safety. And I am so very happy that Senator Kamala Harris once again established this clear distinction that it is in our need to create safe spaces in communities that might perhaps allow for a limited need for policing itself, but within the larger construct also of decolonizing knowledge, and more to my love for history. When I think about the rippling effect this murder, this horrific murder of George Floyd is having, I think about just recently, here we have many examples currently in academia that Princeton University, for example, just a couple of days ago, has decided to remove the name Woodrow Wilson from its School of Public Policy. This is major. Woodrow Wilson was one of the United States presidents, and the university has decided that it is highly inappropriate in this age or in this attempt for the US to redress its racial injustices, that perhaps the name Woodrow Wilson is not fitting and appropriate for its School of Public Policy. And what is occurring in the world of manufacturing of food? Here we have the manufacturers of Quaker Oats have decided to retire the name or the brand Aunt Jemima from its food products, that after 131 years, the executives at Quaker Oats have decided that we can no longer assign this name to one of our popular food brands, because why? And I quote the executives directly, that the name Aunt Jemima is based on racial stereotypes. And perhaps yet another example is that many states, including the state of Mississippi, has decided to remove the Confederate symbol from its flag. This is major. This occurred also just recently. And an example that I mentioned at the outset of our discussion, or even before it began, we managed to have a preliminary discussion before everyone joined us today. Just recently, as I was riding along with my youngest son, we're listening to one of my favorite programs on NPR, which is Planet Money. And the guest on the program last Saturday is Dr. Lisa Cook. She is a professor of economics and international relations at Michigan State University. And she shares this fascinating story about how it took 10 years for her research, a research paper that she had invested 10 long years to find a home of publication. And what was this research that she produced? She was examining how, following the end of slavery, beginning with Reconstruction and leading up to the horrors of the Tulsa riots in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that there was this period in which African Americans were making major innovations, that she brought into question or re-examine Paul Romer's economic theory about innovation. And while doing so, she found that maybe perhaps being innovative and having laws that address patents may not necessarily be enough for people of color and specifically for African Americans. And what did she find? She found something extraordinary, which spoke to that following the 1921 massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a major decline in the number of patents that African Americans brought forward. And I will quickly conclude here because I know I'm limited with time. Why this particular example is so very important for this discussion about decolonizing texts and the decolonization of scholarship in academia. One of the reasons it took her 10 years to find a home for her scholarship grew out of the very institutions through which she submitted her paper. And what she found so very fascinating is that the reviewers of her paper did not have any problem whatsoever with the econometrics of her research. What they found to be troubling and what she found to be absolutely shocking is that her inclusion of historical narratives, such as lynching and extrajudicial killings and the Tulsa massacre in 1921, she was absolutely shocked that these economists had such a limited knowledge about history. And that as a result of that limited knowledge, what did they tell her? That she needs to find a more appropriate, maybe a humanities publication that might be more fitting and appropriate to publish her paper. So what did she do? She didn't give up. She went to Nobel laureates such as Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize for economics. And what did he tell her? He informed her that you have something, you have discovered a gap in the literature. You may have very well discovered an important argument that serves to claim that economic innovation or the need for innovative ideas may have indeed have been limited by the racial constraints placed on African Americans during this period of time. It took not only Milton Friedman to make the statement and to support Dr. Cook's research, while also bringing in other seminal economists who backed up her research. So I will conclude here by stating that I want to see the academic community reach a critical mass of a discussion to talk about how we do need to unbundle these decolonized concepts, and that the very entities in which we depend on to provide us with the guidelines and how we're supposed to publish, that maybe they need to take another look at their own guidelines, that maybe they're out of touch with today's world of academia.
Wow, Doris, so depthful in your insight. And there's so many things that are coming up for me in terms of what I'm thinking about. Maha asked me to jump in here. I'm just going to throw in a quick provocation just as a follow-up. And then we'll hear from Kim, I think, and then Maha, and then finish up the panel, and then get into the conversation. So my questions, I'm just going to throw out some questions, guys, and I hope that we can loop back around and address these together. In what ways are our scholarly practices also activist practices? In what ways are we opening up the academy? How can we take concrete steps to listen, to learn, to collaborate with those who have previously been unheard and certainly unauthorized? And I'm interested in this word of authorization, what it means to be an author. These questions are directed not only, these questions that are coming up today, they're not directed only towards citation practices. There's a much larger scale question that we're all sort of eager to take up. So how do we address these issues of power and this question of inclusion in our scholarship, in our citation, but also in our pedagogy, in our mentorship practices, in our reach towards new forms of leadership? Because God knows we are struggling with leadership, and we need to insert within a notion of leadership explicitly the idea of moral courage. So those are my little questions of provocation, and I just want to also sort of enter into those questions with two concepts that I thought about this morning. Like, what am I going to say? The one thing that's been coming up a lot is the whole idea of unlearning in my mind. So much of the academy is about tradition and about building upon those traditions and learning about expectations, etc. So I'm interested in the things we have to unlearn, and that kind of work is hard work. It's hard to identify, then it's hard to do. The other concept that I wanted to share with you guys, just because I think it leads into starting to answer these questions, is the concept of co-learning, which I've been talking about for a long time. And that's simply standing side by side with everyone who you interact with as a co-learner. And the academy is so much about hierarchy and establishing of expertise and mastery. So, what role do we have in dismantling that? And what steps do we take to actually sort of open up the space for real, authentic co-learning experience? So yeah, I think that one of the things I just will end with and then pass on the baton quickly is just this idea of academic writing a bit, because I think the place, because partly it's my interest in my area of scholarship, but also because academic writing in some ways is so much like a gatekeeper for who's in and who's out. And so I wanted to introduce the idea of linguistic justice, that we speak differently depending on where we come from, and that there's a politics to language, and that the academy upholds particular forms of language as a kind of authorization of intelligence and worth and value. And so I think there's a really fantastic book that has just recently come out by a scholar named April Baker Bell. It's called Linguistic Justice, and it's all about this question of the violence that's being done in the context of language and expectation around language, in scholarship, in pedagogy, in community building, etc. I also wanted to give a shout out to my co-learners who are former graduate students who have taught me profound things about these issues that we're talking about today. And there's two of them in particular I want to talk about. The first is named Doris Jones. He's now a lecturer at Virginia Tech. And he guided me as I was his, advisor, of course, but he taught me so much in his master's thesis, which was about code meshing, which is different than code switching. And basically, he wrote an entire master's thesis in the language of code meshing, which is a moving back and forth between languages and making meaning in those spaces. Not necessarily the kind of master's thesis that most, okay, I have 60 seconds, that most academics would authorize. They'd say you have to write properly, you have to write in correct grammar, etc. So I shout out to Doris Jones, and then the other co-learner is Kavina Bullock, who's in this hangout right now, and I'm so proud of her. She just finished her master's thesis, and it's called You Sound Black. And basically, it's about the stigmatization of a language that you're born into, that is your first fluency and is powerful and should be authorized, but the academy keeps it out. And she works through that. So I'm passing the baton on. Sorry about my speaking so much, but I want to hit upon those issues of linguistic justice as a part of the conversation.
Thank you, Mia. I think we need to decolonize time so that we can all have the space to speak. Kim, I wanted to know if you want to say a few words before I say mine. I tried to send you a private message.
I will, because I'll keep it really short, because I'm going to diverge a little bit. I did answer a lot of questions or provide some tips in the Google document, but I want to talk about, what are we doing in front of the classroom? And Maha invited me to join, and I was like, well, it's not really something I do. It's not my area of expertise. But by default of who I am and my experience in life, the examples I bring to the classroom are drastically different than what someone else brings. And I must say that I do it so organically that I don't notice that I'm exposing my students to sort of my background and backgrounds that are distinctively different than theirs. And that's wherever I go, whoever I'm teaching to, which is generally not people who look like me. But I'm always trying to emphasize a point, which is usually, a story that has a lot of storytelling. There's a piece I use in my class about a female boxer named Clarissa Shields. And it comes from a Radio Diaries program. And she documents her life. And the students are fascinated that, I think some of them say they're fascinated that she's a female boxer, but then she's a Black female boxer. So there's an added layer of exposure to a life that they're unfamiliar with. And so I think we need to be doing more of that. Like when I introduced them to Toni Morrison or Maya Angelou. Now, I wouldn't say introduce them, but I think they've read about them, but they haven't seen a video of these women who are really dynamic and legends of their own. So I think that also helps us build whole students so that they're coming out with more knowledge, because the stories that we're listening to in class are usually 5 or 10 minutes. So in that little bit of time, I'm already able to expose them to something that may have a lasting impression. So I think pulling together those kinds of materials has just as much value.
Thank you so much, Kim. And I'm gonna riff off of what you just said there, because as someone from my part of the world, we've sort of internalized some kind of Western colonization of what counts as knowledge. And I think even when I started off my PhD, it never occurred to me to, something Sanette wrote in the Google Doc, to ask my students to use references from their own native language or from their own native context, or for myself as a teacher initially to start bringing in that kind of material. And so only when I started to get exposed to postcolonialism and started to thinking of decolonial, starting to realize how difficult it is actually to overcome that mindset. And then when you read that literature, to discover yourself in it and feel like all your education beforehand felt foreign and felt like you were always a consumer of that knowledge because you didn't see someone like yourself producing knowledge and saying the kinds of things that sort of what Tutaleni was also saying, like finding yourself in that literature that's talking about your own culture or your life. And it reminds me of something else that Jasmine was talking about and Doris before we went live, which is what counts as knowledge. I think we all talked about this a little bit. And there's a Palestinian mathematics educator called Munir Fesha, who did his PhD in Harvard. And when he first started there, I don't know if anyone knows this story, he started there and he said, he asked them, could I use my mom as a reference and the Palestinian chicken? And of course, Harvard laughed at him, like, these are not sources of knowledge that you can cite in an academic PhD. And they didn't allow him to use them. But then in future papers, he did use them. And it's about thinking about how, for example, indigenous knowledge is often not written in ways that are acknowledged, and how even building things like Wikipedia, which is not peer reviewed, but still has criteria for what is acceptable and what isn't, and what kind of stories get told, because certain knowledge is considered authoritative and certain knowledge not. And just a very quick thing that I write about in my blog post about inclusive citation is, how do we change our daily habits so that it becomes easier for us to all the time be citing diverse and especially marginalized scholars? So not because we're being nice or not because it just enriches our work, because it will enrich your work, but also for social justice reasons, because the truth has so many different dimensions. And we've only been, for the most part, exposed to one point of view all this time. And so, like, for me, it's about changing your habits intentionally to the extent it then becomes natural for you. So if you follow more scholars on Twitter, if you're on social media, if you follow more scholars on Twitter who are people of color and different from yourself, if you intentionally every morning, when you decide which link to click on and which article to read, you prioritize the articles of women and marginalized people, and you read those first, they will become easier for you to find later, and you will find their scholarly work when they publish it. But always keep in mind that women and minorities often either find it more difficult to publish for the reasons that Doris mentioned, that it's not even accepted into publication, but also they have other responsibilities and often in the academy are given more service work and things like that to do. So their effective labor is so much higher and obviously women who have children, that's another burden as well. Not burden, obviously kids are beautiful and everything, but you know what I mean. That's another thing that takes up their time. So I'm gonna stop here. Kim, do you want to maybe pick one or two questions from the Google Doc that you think are worth starting with, that maybe the written answers are not enough and maybe we want to hear from everyone? I think maybe the first one, I can't remember. And then we'll open it up for questions here, I think.
Sure, let's go ahead with that. I don't have the document in front of me.
Let me share my screen. I think I've got it.
That'll be perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is a good one, I think. Shall I read it out? What are the key structural barriers that are impeding inclusive citation practices, and are there key differences between fields and regions? I know that Jasmine had started answering that. So Jasmine, would you like to start us off? And then the rest of us can respond as well.
Yeah, this is a question I've thought about for quite some time as someone who has always been critical about academia. I remember in college, there was a really prominent Black feminist who came to my institution, and I thought her research was just amazing. And I told her, I asked her, I said, how do we get this information out to the public? And she just kind of looked at me like, why would you do that? And I remember thinking, wow, okay, I guess that's not the purpose of academia. But I've always been very critical of how we're going about this. And one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot is the way that we operationalize impact value and how many times it's cited and in which journals it's cited. And, you know, for example, in my discipline, the Howard Journal of Communications has less of an impact value compared to another journal that perhaps doesn't center the experiences of Black Americans. And I'm wondering why is that? Who are these gatekeepers? And so, yeah, I think it takes a radical reconceptualization of what we mean by impact in the academy, not being afraid to publish in open access journals. I know that is still a very dirty term in academia, but when we think about the fact that the research that we're doing is funded by, at least in the US context, is funded by taxpayer dollars sometimes, and yet the general public can't access our research. I mean, we have to revisit, why are we doing what we're doing? And so, yeah, for me, it starts by how are we defining impact in the academy? How are we defining things like self-publishing? Things like that I feel like are words for devaluing the scholarship of marginalized scholars.
Great. I think we're now going to go to folks who are here. Thanks, Jazz. That was really well said. I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
I'm going to just kind of start in a random place, but Deb Morrison made a bit of a lengthy comment, but maybe you can formulate that into a question and we can get some dialogue started.
Which one? This is such a fascinating conversation. Thank you all so much for sharing. It's fabulous. I'm not sure which one, Kim, you were looking at.
I was looking at the framing the counter narrative.
Oh, yeah. So this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. Megan Bang is a peer. And in thinking about Indigenous work, we've been struggling with understanding, I'm a critical race scholar, and in thinking about how we frame in opposition to something, or how we actually just get underneath current structures like white supremacy and think about, like, what do we want to build differently? So, and I think it comes back to Doris's question, which I loved or thought around, like, how could we publish differently? How could we promote differently? How could we just do something different and, like, put aside the thing that promotes whiteness in our publication stream? So, thought.
Just picking up on that for a second, how do we get underneath something through counter narrative? I was hoping that maybe we could talk about that a little more. What does that mean exactly in terms of storytelling and who's telling and forms of storytelling, et cetera? Does anyone want to sort of tease that out?
I was going to say one very quick thing, and then to Selene. I was going to say that back to the issue we were saying earlier, is that sometimes when you try to tell a story differently than people are used to hearing, the academia doesn't accept it. So for example, when I first started doing collaborative autoethnographies about educational technology, people who co-authored this article with me know we got rejected like 5 or 6 times. And then all of a sudden I can do this, but it took a while until they could accept this. There was one that I co-authored with Mia that got accepted, but the other one, that took forever because it was very different and radical from what they were expecting. And at the same time, every time I read about that topic, not written as a collaborative autoethnography, it felt so alien from my experience that I couldn't. It felt almost, this was disconnected from life. And so, Selene, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that for me, one of the challenges that I have with structuring a counter narrative is that often by doing so, I position something as the default and thereby giving it more power. And I struggle with that because we do need to provide a different way of looking at things. But in my work on Indigenous knowledge, one of the debate that's always there is whether you should refer to something as Indigenous knowledge or alternative ways of knowing. And in both of those terms, there is politics in those words, but amongst it all is really this idea that this thing that we're trying to address is given this power as the default, that which we have to measure ourselves to. So I guess mine is not really as much a response as much as to say that's a difficulty that I have about how do I contribute to this conversation to sort of introduce and contribute my own way of knowing without saying, well, it's an alternative to this because it is legitimate in its own right. And that's that's a space that I'm trying to fight for, that I'm not gonna tell my story in such a way that it's an alternative to somebody else's, but rather just tell my story because that's what it is. And it's good enough on its own. So I often struggle with the counter narrative because I don't know yet how to effectively position myself there.
I'm just thinking that it also is connected to the act of translation and the impulse to translate. And when we remove that on some level and make people live in the other language or the other experience and the other way of telling or knowing, then they just got to acclimate to it, you know, and that I think is a really important move to make, emotionally, intellectually, in terms of like respect, all of those things.
Thanks, Mia. I'm going to call on George to jump in right quick with his comment about scholarly decisions and political connotations. George, do you mind elaborating on that?
See if I can. Thank you for calling on me. I'm going to take a deep breath. It was really just kind of riffing off what Tutalani had said. In every time I hear that conversation about the default position, it kind of sets me off, because having been online, and I don't feel like it's been necessarily a long time, but you know, since the web was new, right? If not, and a little bit sooner, and knowing that everything was being judged through the white male lens, if not the hetero white male lens, definitely a white male lens all the way through, and everything else comes along as a counter or in opposition to that, instead of coming in, I'm going to say, on its own merits. That's not the best way to frame it, maybe, but you know, it's like you have to justify your existence when you come in with anything that doesn't start from that default place. And that is where I was coming from with the comment there. And in fact, one reason I was hanging back is because I think this is one of those moments in time. So, you know, so thanks, you know, Maha and everybody else who helped organize this, because I think that more of the default world is ready to hear it right now. It's over the last month or so, but also because of the earlier COVID unrest, you know, everything that's happened in the last few months has made that default world a little bit readier to at least join the conversation for a while, which means we can land in a slightly different place afterwards, you know, as opposed to going back to the old normal, right? So this is a time of opportunity for us, and that's, you know, why I appreciated hearing all the women's voices today, in addition to Tutalani, but it's definitely, you know, all the women's voices who were brought here today, and, you know, double down all the women of color who have spoken today and brought the perspectives. And, you know, thanks to all the white folks for showing up too, you know, and, you know, great to see some new and old friends in the space here. But I really appreciated it.
Thanks,
You
George.
actually gave me an idea of something that I think everyone can participate in. It's so hard when we're so many people to make sure that there's participation and everyone's voice gets heard. And you sort of put out a call to action that we were also talking about before we went live, Doris and I, especially because we're at the same institution, of what can you do at there are different levels, right? In your own course, in your syllabus, in your scholarship, but also at your institution more broadly. What can you change in your own institution? And also any professional organizations. You were talking, Doris, about like APA, MLA, what professional organizations? This reminds me of something Autumn was saying earlier. Where do professional organizations come in these moments to stand by us in these fights? And so I wanted to give people a chance to just type into the chat, and I'll share this chat later with everyone, if that's okay. You know, what kind of action do you think you could take? What kind of action do you think people should take? Offer shelter to others in hiring committees. Okay. So author with folks if you have clout. That is a really good one. I think that helps a lot of early career scholars. That's a very good one as well. So I'm going to stay quiet so that people type for a minute, and see if anybody wants to speak out. But if anyone wants to speak out from the panelists, like I think Doris, you unmuted, you might have something you want to say.
Oh, I was just going to add to our discussion at the outset, or actually before we began this discussion. As you correctly noted, there are so many ways in which we can immediately take action, certainly within our individual classrooms. Our own autoethnographies become very relevant and very important as we are in the classrooms with our students, our participation with faculty, becoming more knowledgeable of the types of policies that are so very inherent in our institutions of higher learning. But as I also said, while we are witnessing this critical discussion among corporate America specifically, how so many organizations, corporate that is, are donating millions of dollars to Black Lives Matter, organizations that are changing names of their institutions because they have deemed them to be racially insensitive. I would like to see statements that will emanate and resonate from the gatekeepers of information. I would like to see, once again, major international organizations such as the Modern Language Association, the Association, the American Psychology Association, and others who are critically responsible for providing the types of guidelines that allow for our scholarship to be published. I would like to see these voices reach a critical mass that they can recognize a need to re-examine their own policies, to re-examine what peer review actually means. Going back to the point that one of our colleagues raised earlier, which is Amaha, I do believe it, who actually utilized the term linguistic justice, if you will, or as our colleague George indicated, changing the narrative as long as the narrative is one in which the hunter tells the story as opposed to the lion. How can we have diversity, or what I like to refer to also as a translingual or multilingual discussion that recognizes everyone's contribution to academia? And again, I want to end by stating and recognizing the example by Dr. Lisa Cook, that this is such a profound example of a voice that was indeed marginalized by the very communities to which she thought she was a member, that she is a full professor practicing as an economist, and that the very economists to whom she went to have her work published did not find her work valid. Why? Because the very language that she used was not deemed appropriate, that the very language that she used and the methodologies that she brought about, which actually was validated by world-renowned Nobel laureates, that it would take the length of time that it did in order for her voice to be heard. So I think that we are at a critical moment where perhaps this conversation can blossom into others, that we can bring forward, maybe in future discussions, these actual gatekeepers who are responsible for the actual dissemination and what constitutes what knowledge is.
Well said. Thank you, Doris.
Okay.
Thank you, Doris. There's something that's come up in people's registration, and Saba was also commenting on it right now. And I want one of you, either Saba, Catherine, or Francis, to speak up about this, because I think it's a very interesting model that others could replicate in scholarship.
I'm not going to say anything because I didn't set it up, so I'm going to leave it to Francis and Catherine. I think I just love it. I read it and I'm like, this is a really great way of doing it, because it takes so much time to. I'm ending up talking, aren't I? I'm sorry. It takes so much time to to seek out some of these references and citations, because none of the structures that are in place allow for us to find that stuff easily. Everything that's privileged is obviously the more dominant and by default white narratives of stuff and citations. So that FEMED Tech did, here's a CFP, here's a really great bibliography that will help you. I love that. That's a really great example.
Shall I say something?
Please.
Yeah, well, I don't really want to say very much because it's a very early start with a bibliography. But what I would say is that this is a bibliography that we've started. It's certainly not a canon of work or perfect in any way, but it's a very early start for something that we hope will become interesting and good. And it's to go with a call for papers for a special issue on feminist perspectives on learning, media and technology. And basically we've just got the stuff we've started with, but we're working towards a process where more people can add to it. And the idea is that at this stage, it may be of help to people writing abstracts for the call for papers. But in the next stage, when we hope we've got the process better, that actually scholars, authors who are going to write full papers for the special issue will be able to share their references as they're writing without necessarily having to speak to each other. So it's quite a sort of, it's a sort of a sort of material form of sharing that isn't just about being social and discussing things, and that they might help each other without actually having to interact with each other. They're interacting through the bibliography. And that sounds a bit complicated to us because we haven't actually got it sorted out properly yet. But I've left a link to the bibliography in the GDoc, and I can post one here. And I think I've said enough now.
Thank you, Frances. I mean, I think that activism, when you're given the opportunity to be the special issue editors, and you do this thing that both helps you use activism in the sort of references that you're recommending, but also the crowdsourcing process, and then that method of supporting authors so that you're saving them time. We know that women, especially women, and you guys also published on that, are struggling right now to get published, and they're going to be falling behind in tenure and promotion and all of those things. And so you're both supporting the authors, and you're also ensuring the references that get used in your special issue tend to be more diverse and, again, feminist and so on. So I'm really applauding you for that.
I mean, I don't think we've got the diversity completely right yet, but we've
but you
start.
crowdsource it, so we'll bring in the diversity, right? If you invite enough diverse people, isn't that right? Like bring the right people in who will bring the diversity, and let them do that.
Yeah, just leave us a bit of space to get the process right, because we're very, very busy at the moment.
I understand, and we'll contribute for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, we're coming up on the hour. I can personally stay for another 20 minutes or so. My daughter's not too cranky right now, so I'm sorry that some of you cannot stay. If someone needs to go, I think you could say goodbye, and of course we'll all understand. We'll keep the recording going for a little bit more. If anyone, even the panelists, have to leave, that's completely fine. I will stay a little bit more because I feel like maybe some people need to stay a little more, and we'll keep contributing to the Google Doc, and I'll publish it maybe on Equity Unbound website with the video of this session. And I'll also send people who've signed up the Zoom version of the recording, because it's going to have a transcript if that helps you or allows you to share it with people who might prefer that.
Great.
Thank you, Kavina. Oh, look forward to the next one. No pressure. Maybe folks who participated and have ideas could let us know, let Mia and me know, and we could have another one for sure.
Yeah, we might have to do a workshop.
That's a good idea. How do you create a decolonial anti-racist? That's a great idea. Let's do that.
And do it.
Let's do it. Yeah, for sure.
Kim,
I was originally going to do, go ahead. Okay, let's do it.
I think that's a brilliant idea, because I think having the pragmatics of how do we do these things, what does it mean when you offer shelter in an institution? What does it mean how do you get in to be a reviewer? How do you, those are things I think that are super helpful to learn and figure out, to Maha's point earlier. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's a great idea. Let's do that. That's the next session then, inshallah. And maybe that one will use breakout rooms so that people can focus on different topics. So some people might want to focus on how do I decolonize my syllabus, and others focus on how do I decolonize whatever. And then we come back together and share out. I think that would be good. And maybe record the breakout rooms.
That's a great
because
plan.
I keep doing that. Yeah. Okay, we have a plan. Awesome. And now we just have to find it. Inshallah. Okay, now some people have started leaving, and I think there are a few who might want to stay a little bit more. Rolando, do you want to say that out loud? It's a question, right?
Yes, it's kind of like in these efforts, how can one validate, right, that what we're seeing, that effort on campus, that article we're reading, that literature we're including in our class is actually helping decolonize and not actually contributing to furthering it, you know, like, for example, it appears to be something that is opening up, is trying to be inclusive, but it's kind of excluding other voices within, for example, being Black, being Latino, being a feminist, being gay, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. Who would like to respond to that? Jasmine and Tutaleni are nodding, so I'm guessing one of them wants to. No pressure.
I was more so thinking like, okay, how do we do that? I don't have any answer right now, but.
The first thing that came to mind as you said that is that these kinds of things can be done in a tokenistic way. And that's the first thing you want to make sure it's not. So that it's not the one article by Maya Angelou or the one poem by Maya Angelou in the midst of mostly white stuff. Or this is a very tricky one. And Jasmine, I'm just doing this to give you time to think. I wasn't interrupting you. I was giving you more time to think. I was helping. Is that what could end up happening? Okay, so I'm just going to say this real quick. I'm part of this thing where they have 100 experts and they tell you have people from 30 countries, and Tutaleni will understand this, from 30 countries, but actually the other 70 people are all from America and Canada. And there's one from Egypt and one from Namibia and one from China, you know? So that's still tokenizing. Yes, you have 30 countries, but you have 70 people from pretty much the same part of the world, the same privileged part of the world. And so, and then obviously from the other 30 countries, there's like France and the UK and other privileged countries. So you're really got like 5 global South people maybe. And so that's one of the things. The same with your readings or with your, and decolonizing is not just the material, but also the processes, right? Like how do you design so that you decolonize time, which I'll get back to later because someone wants to know what I meant by that. But so the not tokenizing is a very good first step, I think. Another one would be checking in with minorities and students themselves who are from minority backgrounds, because you may or may not have diverse students or diverse organizations. Sometimes you need to look and reach out beyond that. Jasmine, Tutaleni, yeah, you're ready, go.
I would echo Maha's point in terms of making sure that you're asking your students, what do they need? What are they looking for from this classroom experience? And then going back to the point that I made earlier, it's not going to solve everything, of course, but making sure that it isn't just oh, I have one Black female scholar, I have a queer scholar, I have this scholar. It's really engaging in their scholarship in a meaningful way, like, you know, applying it to your own local condition, your lived experiences, applying it to another form of scholarship that you've read. And so I think that helps, but also I think more importantly, what helps is to realize this is an ongoing process and that we're going to make mistakes in this process, that unfortunately with all the intention, I'm not making excuses, right? Because we like to hide behind our intentions, that unfortunately we might leave out someone or leave out a way of producing knowledge, and just making a commitment to correcting that. And just, again, this lifelong commitment, this career-long commitment in terms of engaging in these type of practices. So I'm not sure if that quite answers the question completely, but I think it is very, very difficult, but just because it's difficult doesn't mean we should not be doing it.
I absolutely agree. And I think for me, it's hard. I don't know how you validate that. But I think for me, the way my perspective is that my goal as an educator is to expose my students to as much of a wide variety of literature and scholarship as possible. I often start off by saying that if I'm the only one who's contributing to the syllabus, that's not going to happen. So the first 2 weeks, my syllabus is always called a draft. And I ask them to contribute to that. And then halfway through the semester, I usually give an assignment in every class where they have to do a paper where I say, write a paper, but I want you to find articles in journals that are outside of the US. And that sort of forces them to then go out there and collect some of those things and expose them to things. Because I think to Maha's point about tokenizing, If I select an article and I say, I want you to make sure that you read this book or read this piece by Julius Nyerere, then that's what you're gonna know about as an African author. But that's not the point that I'm trying to make. I'm trying to make the point of that you have to be exposed to a wider array of work. And I can only do that by building it into my assignment and say, go out there and write a paper that does not use journals that are based in whatever space that you're most comfortable with.
I also just want to piggyback onto this just very quickly, that I think another thing that can be done to move these values forward is to open up spaces for the production of public scholarship in classes. So the students themselves come together in collaboration and then end up producing some kind of collaborative scholarly work that speaks immediately to the shared purpose that they find within their own classroom experience. So they can take up local issues that are profound to them, or just find those issues that matter to them and then move that along in ways that also position them to be authors, to authorize themselves and to contribute in the public sphere. And that is where like open education and open production of knowledge is a really powerful vehicle for us as scholars to bring right into our pedagogical practice.
I agree. I think, Mia, you are absolutely right. When I opened the classroom utilizing that very pedagogy that you've described, it does allow the student to feel less stressed. It allows the student to exercise what current knowledge they have. It allows them to validate their current knowledge base. And what I find to be also remarkable is that when we as educators create a space in which the learning process can be navigated in such a way, it's not only liberating for our students, but it's very liberating for us as well. Because I think there is something that we all understand as educators, and that is we assume a lot of power. We do. And I think in the process of attempting to navigate that power, we are constantly re-examining the extent to which we do convey a sense of comfort to our students, that they are indeed contributing to the very production of knowledge in the classroom. And going back to George's point as well, that he allows for his syllabus to be a work in progress. And I like that as well, that all too often, perhaps the syllabus is presented as this contractual agreement that sign it, and this is set in stone, when in fact it should not be. And I would like to also just add an example. When my husband and I lived in South Africa, and we were navigating the post-apartheid environment of South Africa. And we became quite familiar with some of our colleagues who were teaching in the humanities and the social sciences, and how the country was moving forward, specifically with wanting to unbundle the areas of community media for townships such as Soweto and Diepsloot. And there was one particular example that I recall that was so illuminating, was as we began to become more familiar with the urban space of downtown Johannesburg. And we were with a group of students, and we were looking at some of the old buildings, and I wondered why the very architecture of the buildings were not inviting, that I actually used the term that the buildings themselves appeared to be very punitive, that there were not many windows. So as we became more engaged with the students, many of them began to say that the very architecture itself required decolonizing, that the architecture was indeed punitive, that the architecture did not represent a space in which people could move about freely, that the apartheid environment of South Africa was one in which people needed to move, keep moving, that you are not supposed to stay around, that the very physical surroundings of the space was all excluding the vast majority of people. So I cite that example to say and to further agree with Mia and George's point, that as educators, we need to be mindful of our students' capacity to be knowledge producers, that we are not these all-inclusive vessels of information. Certainly, we should be able to come before the classroom with a sense of validation for what we can do. But I often find the classroom becomes far more liberating, even for the educator, when students are actually able to see just how much they can contribute to their own knowledge production.
Thank you so much, Doris. You're so right.
She is.
Leslie wanted to say something, so I'm going to give him the floor.
Thanks, Maha, and hi, everybody. So I think much of what I want to, say have already been said so well, eloquently by everybody else, but I think I want to bring up the issue about gatekeeping and power. And I think one areas that we don't think much enough about are these institutions of publishings that are deeply colonial in nature, and yet we're still very much subject to their approval. And I'm always find paradoxical critical scholars that I know that insist on publishing in these presses that are highly oppressive historically, and yet they insist on publishing and they're not questioning how they are perpetuating that colonial structure. And when you even raise these with my colleagues, they said, well, why are you, picking on something that is not an issue? But I said, this is exactly the kind of inequality that we perpetuate. And so we need to, I think, challenge some of these publishing houses, their historical power. And I want to bring your attention, if you haven't heard about this group called the Radical Open Access Collective. And this is a collective of independent, small open access publishers that are finding different ways to publish not just journals, books, but other artifacts of scholarship. And I think I would like to, us to think about supporting these independent, scholar-run, community-driven initiative as really what open access is key for. Like open access now has been co-opted by the big publishers, but has always been grassroots-driven from the start. So, and this notion of radical open access goes hand in hand with another ideas that I really like. This is about bibliodiversity. And that is diversity, not just in thinking, but in forms, in expression, and in representation. And I think over the years, we have seen this decimation of bibliodiversity by the big publishers, creating what Vandana Shiva calls the monoculture of the mind. And I think that open access, supporting bibliodiversity and independent scholarships is a way to regenerate the kind of diversity that we need, particularly in a troubling world that we live in right now. We need diversity.
Here, here, I agree. Yes.
Yes, I agree as well. Thank you so much for putting it out there.
Thank you, Leslie. Omara, you mentioned in the chat, I don't know if you want to say this out loud, because I have your take on this before we start responding to it. Are you still there? So Omara was asking about decolonizing time, and I was wondering what other people understood.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, go ahead.
Hi. Sorry if you're hearing any background noise. I'm with my kids right now. So like the decolonization of time, what I've understood from that and how I've applied it in the classroom has been like not marking my students late. Right. And I know that's something like that is like forced upon us to do as professors, and as educators. And it's an incentive to come on time to class. But what I really learned is that especially people of color really appreciate the time that they have, like the time they spend with each other, and not necessarily coming 15 minutes before class starts. They don't consider that being on time. They really value the time spent with each other and the rich discussions that we have. So that's how I've interpreted. So I haven't heard anyone say that before. So that's why I was just interested in Maha, when you said that, and what you meant by that, and also like how you have applied it as well.
I feel like a tweet coming, like how would you decolonize time, and see how different people interpret this kind of thing. I'm very interested in the way you mentioned. And as you said that, I was also thinking, especially people with mental illness, this lateness becomes an issue, especially people who have depression and take medication, makes it difficult to come to class on time, or people who are living alone for the first time and can't wake up. There's all sorts of reasons why someone would have that issue. And I think a lot of professors just get angry and mark them late or mark them absent or whatever. And that's a great point you're making. When I said decolonize time, I meant something specific, which is how can I make sure that everyone has the space they need to speak? Because giving everyone the same amount of time to speak does not produce social justice. Because think about the non-native, not the case for anyone here, but the non-native speaker who speaks slower. And you give them, you do a debate or something. I don't like debates anyway, but anyway, if you give them the same amount of time, I mean, even every kind of attempt to create equitable conversations talks about giving everyone equal time or equal number of words. Also, collaborative autoethnography as a way of writing takes up a lot of words to be able to tell a narrative, to tell a story. But then journals give you a limited amount of space to write. And so all of those ways in which quantifying equality becomes not equitable in the end. And that's sort of what I meant by decolonizing times. I didn't want to stop Doris from speaking because what she was saying was so compelling. And at the same time, I wanted to give time to the next speaker and make sure that people had time to ask questions. And sort of, I think asynchronicity is a kind of decolonizing time in the sense that everyone can type in the chat. And even though I won't be able to read it now, we all spoke if we wanted to, and then we can read it later. But it's still not the same as spotlighting someone and letting them speak out loud. So it's sort of giving something, but it's not the equivalent of speaking aloud. And now I am colonizing the conversation, colonizing time right now. Yeah. So Autumn, did you want to ask your question out loud, or was it?
Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you for asking the question, because I just said it and I didn't really follow up. So you made me think of it more. Autumn, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I thought it was funny that we were talking about all that, and in the chat you were saying, do you want to ask this out loud? And I'm like, if there's time, it's just kind of meta, right? So yeah, I was just feeling like maybe, so this is actually, yeah, this is something I'm trying to figure out. It's just something that's been bothering me about professional organizations and you know, how they amplify voices and how they work in power. And then specifically the thing that bothers me with professional organizations is that a lot of times they have sponsorships, right? They have vendors that they bring in. And so they are, there's this money aspect behind it. And I was feeling a lot of a connection with the publisher, the same kind of thing that publishers do, where they amplify certain voices and dampen other voices. But I especially feel this, like, there's something really problematic about professional organizations that are using sponsorships and sponsoring. So for me personally, the one that's been bugging me the most lately are some of these surveillance technologies that are used in the classroom to surveil students. They can be highly problematic. Sometimes they're using facial recognition, and we know that that can have lots of problems where, you know, it misidentifies Black faces over white faces and things like that. And so it just seems really like kind of counterintuitive that I would go to a professional organization, take all the time to like put together this criticism of it, and then the organization is actually, you know, sponsored by this these technologies that do this kind of thing. And a lot of times I'm paying to go to the conference, right? So yeah, so I'm just seeing that there's maybe some connection here with the publisher piece of it. And it's just something that's been really bothering me for the last couple of months, and I'm trying to work it out.
Absolutely. These are the gatekeepers. Your example speaks yet again to the very gatekeepers to whom we rely upon to provide us with the very venues in which our scholarship may or may not be published. So I go back to my original statement just before our session began. How can we begin to develop a critical mass, reach a critical mass in this discussion where these very entities who may very well be supported by sponsors and that maybe sponsorship, while important, may not necessarily constitute the need for suppressing marginalized voices or suppressing voices that are necessarily needed to advance this conversation. And I think we're beginning to see it, maybe not so much in academia, but I am just absolutely amazed with the level of consciousness that is arising out of the Black Lives Matter movement, that so many corporations have come forward and they're pushing back against the vitriol, the negative commentary associated with Black Lives Matter, that these major corporations are pulling their advertising from right-wing conservative commentary that is lending itself to absolute derogatory representations of what Black Lives Matter stands for. So I applaud the efforts of these corporate entities. I applaud the efforts of these organizations that are taking a stand. And again, I must say that we need to see the same kind of galvanizing impact to be voiced by these academic gatekeepers that I am just anxious to hear, not just the individual colleges and universities, because many of them have come forward, such as the one I referenced earlier, Princeton University, removing the name of Woodrow Wilson from its School of Public Policy, Middlebury College in Vermont. I mean, there are many that we can cite as examples of institutions of higher learning who are making statements and perhaps even moving beyond just simply making a statement. It is one thing to put forth a statement that is beautifully written, that can be read again and again, but it is actually in the actions that are taken. Substantive, viable actions that organizations can take that can move forward this discussion so that we can see the type of change that could perhaps allow for suppressed voices, marginalized voices, and the kinds of scholarship that is not hidden or suppressed. So I do hope. I'm sorry.
I said I agree.
Yeah.
Let's do that. Let's have a session about action. Like we've had the discussion. I think we've started surfacing a lot of the possible actions, but maybe we can come up with sort of a white paper that we send organizations, like here are all the different things you can do.
Exactly.
And it's curated by this international group of people, right?
Yes.
So.
Yeah, because a statement is just not enough. I teach in crisis communication. You can't just put out a cute little D&I statement and say you support Black lives or whatever it is that you're trying to put out, and then not have a corrective action plan in place and a detailed one. Even sometimes getting a statement out there is difficult. That happened in my own department, and I'm okay with saying this because we need to call this stuff out. I talked to my department head about putting out a BLM statement, and what was instead said to me was that there was another situation going on with white student journalists, and that took priority over putting out a statement. And so I told my Black students this because I wanted them to know what the real deal is. And we finally put out a statement, but just the fact that I had to fight that hard to put out a statement that had no corrective action plan in place. And on top of this is a school of communication, So and for me, that was just a reminder, wow, this is what we are
up against.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's out there now.
But I definitely like the point about the action. If you're going to have a statement, you should be doing some inward looking to say, what are we going to change?
Exactly.
And so, yeah, these statements, there's a lot of time spent on picking the words, or maybe not a lot of time, just depends on what statement it is. But there really should be an action plan. I was working with a board, and of course I initiated the letter writing process. But I'm like, we need to do this. And then I was very, very firm about there have to be action points. and they have to be, very sincere. They can't be just surface. But yeah, we need more of that and less of the filler stuff.
Absolutely.
I mean, what if our syllabi were being judged by how well and how diverse they reference diverse authors and marginalized authors rather than by how well they reference canonical authors? What if our promotion was tied to publishing in open access journals? What if our promotion was tied to, or our hiring or whatever was tied to how much our work is doing good in the world rather than just publishing 10 articles from the same research study and just counting the numbers? There's so much I think that we should sit and talk about and come up with all these things and put them all in one place. I'm sure there are pockets of people who have talked about this in different places, but I think just a group of people who came in today, and not just the panelists, honestly, everyone who's been here today has been saying some really wonderful stuff in the chat. It's very difficult for me to keep up, but I'm going to go back and read it. And I need to wrap up. I just wanted to give the panelists a chance to say one last thing in 30 seconds. Doris, you want to start?
Oh, I am just so very happy that you have begun this conversation for us. It is one that I have nurtured for some time. And once again, something that I think you and I have developed over the years that we have been colleagues and that we recognize the importance of building discourse communities. We are certainly building a discourse community. So thank you, Maha.
Zelini had to leave. Jasmine, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I don't really have too much more to say. I kind of stated this earlier, how this moment feels different. And so I am cautiously hopeful. My hope is that in this moment, again, we're not reproducing unseen labor that's disproportionately put on scholars of color, like emotional labor. I'm all of a sudden very popular during this time. There's a joke going on about how Black scholars' email inbox are very full now. And so I tell that joke just to say, I'm hoping that we view this as a shared responsibility and not just the responsibility of scholars of color.
Absolutely. Thank you for making that point, Jasmine. And I think there were definitely a lot of allies in the room today. I think they were giving the rest of us space to speak. But I know that they, in the chat, I could see a lot going on there, and I can see a lot of action. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what we're up against, that, the people who show up are a part of the choir. And how do we get to the rest of them?
You sing really loud.
What do I say? Say it louder for the people in the back.
Yes.
Yeah, we got to get the word out to everyone. And so I'm really excited that we might continue this in the form of a workshop. And
I'm glad that you brought it up. I'm glad that you brought it up, so it's not seen as me throwing more labor on you.
No, I think it's necessary. And so, isn't it true that we always prioritize, certain things that we're really passionate about? So yeah, I'm down for that.
Yeah, awesome. And Mia.
Just gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's 30 minutes past. Thank you, everyone who stayed longer. You did not have to do that, so I really, really appreciate this. I owe you a coffee or something next time we meet. Inshallah, someday we meet. I'm going to turn off the recording. I've posted the recording already. No, not the recording. I've posted the YouTube link inside the blog post.